Hello, it's Gail here from Three Wise Crafters, and welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to use some new products from Altenew's June release, including the Botanical Honeycomb 3D embossing folder and the coordinating colouring stencil set. I have a piece of cardstock here that is trimmed to 6 inches by 6 inches, and it is Hammermill Premium Colour Copy Cover. So I place that in the embossing folder, and then I follow the sandwich guide on my Spellbinders Platinum die cutting machine. As the Altenew 3D embossing folders are thinner than Spellbinders, I place in a paper shim there just for some extra pressure. Once that goes through our die cutting machine, you can see the dimension and texture that the embossing folder gives you cardstock. So I have my cardstock and the stencil taped down to my Wendy Vecchi Make Art Station, and now I'm just using Lavender Fields from the Shades of Purple Crisp Dye ink range. And I have a lot more crisp dye inks in my ink stash than I do the fresh dye ink range, so I tend to use that a lot when I'm making cards. So I have also cut out a lot of the ink blending. I show you the start and the finish of each colour, but I don't show you all of the ink blending, otherwise the video would be quite long. So out of this one piece of cardstock, I was able to make 2 cards, but I could have made 3 cards out of it as well. So I'll show you the process for 2 cards, and I'll talk you through the 3rd card. I also use this stencil on its own without the embossing folder, and I make a different project altogether that's not card related, and I made that for my daughter. So now I'm moving on to the Deep Iris, and that's still in the Shades of Purple family. And I'm using a fine detail brush here, and that just allows me to concentrate the shading where I want it. If I used a mini blending brush or a regular blending brush, I would have got too much ink in areas that I didn't want. And I also needed to be careful of the little flowers, which we'll do a little bit later. So this blending brush is really easy to use, and I have a range of these blending brushes that come in 3 sizes. So I'm using the largest of the 3 sizes here, and a bit later you'll see me use the smallest size. And this just allows me to put the ink where I want it to go and not get it in areas that I don't want it to go. So once I've done that, I end up going back with the Midnight Violet, and I ink blend over the top. I wasn't really happy with how the color was looking. It was more purple, a darker purple, and I wanted to have sort of that pink tinge that you can sometimes have to your purple colors. So I really liked how this color turned out, but you'll see later when I do the other petals for these flowers that I don't use the Midnight Violet, and that's just to create different colors and shading on our flowers. So once we have finished these flowers, we can move on and do our little flowers in between, which I end up doing in a completely different color. So here I'm using Aqualicious, and that's from the Sweet Dreams crisp dye ink range that I'm using, but it's also available in the fresh dye ink. So I'll have all the supplies listed in the video description below, so make sure that you check that out as well. And I'll also have some links there to some other videos that I have used 3D embossing folder for with Altenew, which was Sun-Kissed Blooms, and that video I did not long ago. So I'll make sure to link that in the description and above for you as well. And I like using 3D embossing folders in the colouring stencils. I haven't done it a lot, but it makes for really quick and easy cards, and if you trim your cardstock down depending on the design of the embossing folder, you can get multiple cards out of one piece of cardstock like this. So this colour Aqualicious just gives us a bit of a difference on our card and adds a little bit of uh, vibrancy, I think, with that blue. It's quite a bright blue on screen. It When you look at the card when it's finished, it does stand out a fair bit as well, but it is toned down once that ink dries back. So always remember that what your ink looks like when you first ink blend it, it needs time to soak into your cardstock, but also to dry back, which most of the ink colors from Altenew will dry back, and they blend really well together. So here I'm just using rubbing alcohol to spray onto my stencil and then give that a wipe with another cloth. I tend to put my stencil on a cloth underneath and then use a microfiber cloth to clean it. And it cleans up really, really good. And the good thing about using rubbing alcohol is that your stencils will dry straight away and you can use them again if you're batch making some cards. So now I've gone in with the lavender fields and I'm doing the remaining petals on our flowers. And this will just create that shading that I mentioned before and different tones of colors on our flowers. So once we've done all of the ink blending here, I do go in with a second color just to add in that little bit extra shading on our flowers as well. So here I'm using Deep Iris to do the shading, and I use the mini blending brush as well, and that's the largest size in the mini blending brushes. Now you may have some mini blending brushes in your stash, or you may not, but they are really good for fine detail and you end up with a concentrated area of ink. So if you do use them, you may need to tap off like you can see I've done here on screen. And then you can go back in and pick up that ink too. Sometimes I remember to do that, other times I forgot, but yeah, it's there and you can pick that up and use that rather than going back to your ink pad. So I really like using stencils, and if you've watched my videos in the past, you will have noticed that I tend to use stencils a lot. They make for easy cards, and if you're not sure on what to create, getting a stencil sent out and just ink blending is a good way of feeling like you're creating a project and not placing you under too much pressure to have a finished project, and you can always come back to it. So you saw the card and how it was starting to look, and now I've got the Altenew Enchanted Gold pigment ink, and I'm just using a dauber here to apply the ink. I found that that was a little bit harder to use, and it did take some time to apply the ink, but it did get there in the end. It was rather time consuming, but the finished effect of it was well worth it. So if you haven't used a gold pigment ink to do some ink blending with, I highly recommend it. It adds some extra detail onto your card project, and I thought that it gave this card just that little bit of pizzazz that it needed. It just lifted it up a little bit more and highlighted the flowers, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. And I also used the Enchanted Gold on the large flower centers. And then on the small blue flowers, I was able to go in and do that with the embossing folder one. But I wasn't able to do that when I just did the bonus sort of project that I've done at the end of the video. I couldn't use the blending brush then. It sort of didn't work as well, and I ended up changing to a different medium, which you'll see soon. So here I'm just going in and applying more of that ink, and I flipped the stencil so that we could do the other side of our hexagon shapes, which you can see here as well. So that's really easy to line up. You just need to line up the flower centers on those larger flowers, and then your hexagon will come together quite easy. So make sure that you take note of that when you're lining up your stencil to do the flip side of those hexagons. It did take me a little bit to line it up, but we got there in the end. So here is stencil 4, which I don't end up using, and it does the shading around the flowers inside those hexagons. So you can either do that or leave it out like I have. So here I'm using the smallest mini ink blending brush that I have, or the fine detailed brush I should say, and I'm just going in and applying some of that enchanted gold ink on top of the embossed flower centers for our little blue flowers. Now, as I mentioned, that was really easy to do on our embossed piece of cardstock, but not so easy on the bonus project. So I actually like doing fine detail work like this. I quite enjoy more complicated projects. I find that my videos tend to be on the easier side, but I do enjoy making more complicated projects. But to do a video on it, I find that it takes too long, and I don't think many people would want to watch it. But if that's the type of video that you do want to see, please leave me a comment below, because I am more than happy to make more complicated and longer projects if people are wanting to watch them. So here you can see we've done all of our stenciling on our embossed cardstock. So here I just have an offcut from when I trimmed down our 8.5 by 11 hammer mill cardstock into the 6 inches by 6 inches. And this is 2.5 inches wide by 6 inches long. And I'm just going to create a bookmark for my daughter. And I've just masked off the top area here to put a little bit of a sentiment. At this stage, I wasn't sure what sentiment I was going to use. The sentiment that I did end up using was a bit bigger than the area I had masked off, but I think it worked okay. And my daughter, when she saw it last night, after I'd finished making this project, she absolutely loved it. So I'm going to laminate it for her, and she's going to use it as a bookmark. So I'm just using the exact same colors here: Lavender Fields, Deep Iris, Midnight Violet, and Aqualicious, as well as the Enchanted Gold pigment ink. But instead of having an embossed piece of cardstock, I have just placing the stencils straight on top of the cardstock and doing ink blending that way. So it won't have the dimension and texture that our embossed cardstock does, but it still turns out to be quite good. I didn't think a bookmark that was embossed would stay embossed for very long. It would end up getting flat inside a book, so I didn't bother embossing it. So here we just do the exact same process and use fine detail ink blending brushes to apply the color and tapping that off. This Midnight Violet was quite a juicy ink pad, but also using a fine detailed blending brush, the ink is more concentrated. So if you don't want it to go on really heavy, I would suggest that you tap it off first. And here I'm just applying the Aqualicious to our small flowers, and I'm using a mini detail blending brush here so that I didn't get the ink into our purple flowers. And I did the same on our embossed cardstock as well. So using these stencils, they're quite versatile. You don't have to use them with the embossing folder. You can if you want to, but you can use them by themselves. And the possibilities with the embossing folders, you could create so many variations of cards, just cutting them at different angles or even trimming the hexagons down to individual hexagons, and doing those in a rainbow color would look quite pretty as well. So here I'm just going in with the Deep Iris and applying that over the top of our ink that we've already applied there. So I think I ended up doing a little bit of a different color shade, but when I look at it, I can't see any difference to what I did on our earlier card. or I might have just done the ink blending a little bit back to front. But this panel didn't take me that long to make either, so it was quite quick, and I'm going to end up making some bookmarks for my daughter's friends, but I'm going to do something completely different for those. So I think we're actually on stencil 2, and I'm doing the other shading for the flower, and that's where the deep iris and the midnight violet are being used. So once we've done all of the purple ink blending now, we'll be onto the enchanted gold pigment ink, and you just need to make sure that you hold down, if you're going to apply the pigment ink, the little bits that go into the corner of the hexagon. They're a little bit looser, so they do tend to lift up a little bit, especially with applying the ink with a dauber. And I ended up getting sick of using the dauber, and you'll see here that I changed to a fine detail blending brush, and it's in the smallest size that I have. So with those little corner pieces on the hexagon, you can see that on the left hand side up the top there, they end up lifting up a bit, and you do get a little bit of ink underneath your stencil if you don't hold it down. So just make sure that if you're doing this sort of technique with pigment ink, that you hold those little pieces down while you do your ink blending, and then you won't have any issues with ink going underneath your stencil. So I was really happy with how this turned out. Even though it wasn't embossed, I think it still looks really good. It doesn't have all the detail that our embossed piece does because of the embossing detail that creates shading when you ink blend over the top, but I still liked how this turned out. So I'm really interested to know what sort of card projects you like watching on YouTube. I am relatively new to creating content on YouTube, and I would like to tailor my videos more to what you would like to see. So please feel free to leave me a comment down the bottom as to what you like watching and what videos of mine so far have you enjoyed watching. And then that gives me an idea of what sort of content to create in the future. So this is where I've tried the mini detail blending brush to apply some ink onto our blue flowers, and it just was a disaster. It just didn't go on how I wanted it to, and I ended up giving up, and I went to a gold gel pen instead. And I just did little circles in the center of the blue flowers, and that worked just as well. So you could always do that too. Just because some techniques didn't work doesn't mean that I gave up. I just tried to think, what else could I do there instead? And I liked how it turned out. So I'm just trimming down our 6" by 6", and I've decided that I would cut off a strip, and that sort of made it more into an A2 size card panel, just slightly smaller though. Once I trimmed off the far left hand side edge to bring that in, because that leaves a flat edge on your cardstock from the embossing folder. And then I've just trimmed the A2 sort of size panel at an angle, and this creates our first card. Now the offcut from this panel, you could have made that into another card, which I didn't, but you certainly could use that to make a third card out of this 6" by 6" card panel. So here I've just got a piece of purple cardstock that I have in my stash, and I've just got that from a big box craft store in Australia. So just use what you have in your stash that will coordinate with your inks, and I'm just trimming that down. I haven't measured it, I'm just eyeballing it and hoping for the best. If it didn't work, then I was in trouble. I would have had to start my project again, but it worked okay. So I just took my time to do that, and once I had it lined up, it was fine. So now I have Nina Solar White in 110 pounds, and I am just scoring that at the 4 1/4 mark to make an A2 card base. And then I just use a bit of low tack tape and I roll that up into a circle piece so that I can hold my card flat while I place my card panel on top. And I'm just using Gina K Design Connect Glue here in a fine tip bottle for all of my gluing on today's projects. So once we have the glue applied, I'll be able to line that up onto our card base. And I use Nina Solar White for all of my card bases. It's quite sturdy, so it can take a fair amount of weight. So I line up the top left-hand corner and then I line up the folded edge, sorry. And once I've got that all lined up, it drops into place quite easy. So now this stamp set is the Billowing Peonies stamp set, and it's quite a large stamp set. It's 8.5 by 11 inches, and there's coordinating stencils as well as a die set. So I'm just using the thanks sentiment from that set, and that's because it was sitting on my desk. I wanted to create a project with it. I've had some fun just using the stencil once, and it was a lot of fun, and the options with using that Billowing Peonies is just endless, especially with the size of it. You could do one card panel with stenciling and it would create multiple cards for you. So I've just used VersaFine Onyx Black. I like using that for the sentiments, and I did thanks on that card. And for this one, I am using the You Are Beautiful, Just the Way You Are, and that's on the bookmark for my daughter. And again, I'm just using VersaFine Onyx Black ink for the sentiment. The Onyx Black ink for sentiments is really good. I don't tend to condition my stamps when I'm using that ink pad, and it goes on perfectly the first time. It didn't stamp properly here, and that was more because of the pressure I was applying and how close that stamp was on the Misty. And I just clean it off with water that I have in a Spellbinders Mister Spray. And that Mister Spray from Spellbinders is so great. If you haven't got one in your stash, I would highly recommend it. It's really good. So now I've decided to create an extra card. And this, I'm just using that straight panel that I had die cut earlier. And I'm just applying some glue onto the back of that piece of cardstock. And I'm using the exact same shade of purple cardstock to do a matte for it as well. So once we have that all glued on, I will end up gluing it onto a Nina's Solar White 110-pound card base, just like we did on our earlier card. So I just have our card panel with our embossed piece here to line up the sentiment. I'm just using thanks again, but you could have used any sentiment that you have. I just find that I need a few thank you cards now with my business. So I thought I would take the opportunity today just to make thank you cards. So I'm using the VersaFine Onyx Black ink pad again and just applying that ink to our sentiment and then stamping that down on the card base. And once we have that stamped, we can then glue down our card strip onto the front of our card base. And I'm just using Gina K Design Connect glue again in the fine tip bottle. And I find using this makes it much easier, especially when I'm doing fine detail sentiments. So here I'm just lining that up onto our card base and making sure that it's straight under the sentiment as well. So once we've done this, I have finished today's projects and shown you 2 ways that you can make cards out of a 6-inch by 6-inch card panel. So I hope that you've enjoyed watching today's video. If you have, please make sure to give it a big thumbs up and to subscribe to the channel while you're there. Thank you so much for watching.